Accompaniment and moral development. The Ratio Fundamentalis Institutionis Sacerdotalis, issued on 8 December 2016, entitled The Gift of a Priestly Vocation, employs the word accompaniment, or a form of the verb to accompany, some 45 times. This document marks the second time since the close of the Second Vatican Council that the Church has addressed at this level the project of forming priests for her service. Now, bear in mind that this lecture inquires about the role that personal and community accompaniment plays in the development of everyone's moral life. Put otherwise, our purpose seeks to illuminate how one person can help another person grow in virtue. Still, I mentioned the recent Vatican document to highlight that the above-mentioned emphasis on accompaniment in formation, with its decided preference for personalist categories, signals that an appreciation for moral mentoring has invaded even the precincts of the Roman congregations. One may reasonably assume that several difficulties with the lives of Catholic priests, especially those that have been brought to public attention since shortly after the new millennium, have moved even Vatican officials and their consultors to encourage what one may call a heightened interpersonal approach to the formation of clerics. In any event, for the moment, accompaniment enjoys, within Catholic circles, a renewed place of prominence. I say renewed place because accompaniment once figured in the development of Christian life and from a very early period. Think of the biographies of those many first millennium saints who sought spiritual instruction from others more experienced than they. However, from at least the 16th century on, this relationship between master and disciple became less prominent outside of institutional settings. Written guidelines for the moral formation of Christians, a ratio, if you will, enjoy a prominent place within the history of Christianity. From the early days of the Church, the formation of monks and nuns received the most articulated attention. Some of these rules, such as the rule of St. Benedict, remain normative and fruitful for certain consecrated persons. Monastic life, broadly construed, continues to provide a controlled form of accompaniment within its institutional structures. After the Council of Trent, some new developments emerge. Two observations seem pertinent. First, the Church began to regulate systematically the institutional formation of clerics, diocesan clerics. For their moral development, diocesan priests were encouraged to follow the injunctions of an approved author in mystical or ascetical theology. Seminary formation introduced these priests to one or another such author. These approved authors and their hefty volumes multiplied after the mid-16th century. Take, for instance, our Dominican brother, Louis of Granada, and his spiritual classic, The Sinner's Guide, published in 1555. Or recall an example close to our own period, The Spiritual Life, a treatise on ascetical and mystical theology by the French Sulpician Adolphe Tanqueray. We actually use that in the novitiate, my novitiate in the 60s. Secondly, other great figures of the post-Tridentine period, the age of the Catholic Reform, took on the novel task of supplying spiritual instruction for the laity. Foremost among these authors remains the Doctor of Geneva, St. Francis de Sales. Well, it proves difficult to generalize about what today we would call the history of spirituality. The theme itself has become the subject matter for handbooks and dictionaries. One may cite most famously the Jesuit competition to the Dominican-produced Dictionnaire de Théologie Catholique, namely the Society's Dictionnaire de Spiritualité, which was completed in 1955. Still, it is generally agreed that the authors of the modern classical treatises on how to live the Christian life adopted a formal approach to one's living out that commitment. This formal approach appears plainly throughout the pages of their guides and their manuals, constructed around methods, rules, instructions, and so forth, to fit in with the casuists' insistence on commandments and precepts. Also, like the casuist moralists, these mystical and ascetical authors addressed their formal instructions to the individual Christian. One does not find in the manuals of moral and mystical theology a great deal about accompaniment, personal or community, as an instrument for growth in virtue. As the late Dominican Father Servet Pinquez has remarked aptly of casuist moral theology, and I quote, "The theme of friendship was lost," close quote. In fact, many of these manuals and books of ascetical theology warned against too much personal involvement with other people, including fellow members of institutes of religious life, fellow seminarians, and even fellow Christians. All in all, St. Alphonsus Liguori, a figure of the 18th century, as you know, summed up the ethos that informs most post-Tridentine spiritual and moral instruction in his celebrated warning, Porro unum est necessarium, that's from Luke 10:42. "One thing is necessary," he wrote, "the salvation of our souls. It is not necessary to be great, noble, or rich in the world, or to enjoy uninterrupted health, but it is necessary to save our souls." St. Alphonsus, of course, realized that Christians dwell in communities and that they enjoy friendships. His evaluation, however, of how much accompaniment by friends can help a Christian to grow in virtue lacks, well, enthusiasm, to say the least. For example, in his popular The Way of Salvation and Perfection, the patron saint of moral theologians expresses this spiritual counsel. The long quote. "He, God, will not be displeased that in your desolations you should go to your friends to find some relief, but he wills you chiefly to have recourse to himself. At all events, therefore, after you have applied to creatures and they have been unable to comfort your heart, have recourse to your Creator and say to him, 'Lord, men have only words for me. My friends are full of words.' Verbosi amici mei," that's from the book of Job. "They cannot comfort me, nor do I any more desire to be comforted by them. Thou art all my hope, all my love. From thee only will I receive comfort, and let my comfort be on this occasion to do what pleaseth thee." Well, there are many other indications that persuade us to recognize that the spiritual authors of the modern period remained chary about how much friends could contribute to one another's spiritual maturity. To be sure, the priest-confessor, and in circles influenced by the Jesuits, the spiritual director, occupied stipulated places within the formal structures that served personal growth. These clerics, however, were not encouraged to become overly familiar with their penitents or persons under their direction. Recall the casuist rules that governed a confessor's accepting gifts from one of his penitents, as well as the strict penalties for seduction in the confessional. One may fairly assume, therefore, that the great spiritual authors upon whom many still rely for spiritual instruction would find it surprising to discover that the Holy See now considers it urgent to set in action within programs of priestly formation an element of personal accompaniment that extends well beyond those conversations that transpire within the boundaries of the confessional and spiritual direction. Second part, some cultural movements. Secular moods also make the emphasis on accompaniment seem an unlikely remedy for clerics or for anyone. Several factors that since the mid-20th century or thereabouts, have affected cultural developments in many regions of the Western world, especially in the English-speaking world, give one moment for pause. Movements, of course, should draw people together when, however, we identify the various kinds of interpersonal congress into which our contemporaries enter. Virtuous examples, regretfully, do not come first of all to mind. Our present circumstances seem not to favor an ecclesiastical authority's advocating for personal accompaniment in Christian formation. One may mistake such an initiative for grooming. That's bad, by the way. You may have thought that only horses were groomed, but we've now given a new connotation to grooming. Yeah. It's really the polite word for seduction. Because of the lasting upheavals that they have caused, one may describe certain social or cultural movements as revolutionary. Consider especially the following social revolutions that have affected Western culture since roughly after the Second World War: the Civil Rights Movement, the Feminist Movement, and what has become known as the Sexual Revolution. Each of these cultural shifts has conditioned the way people relate to each other. Each has affected the realization of friendship, broadly construed. Each also has left the foundations for living the virtuous life in community unsettled. That an analysis of the impact of these movements on friendship turns up largely negative should come as no surprise, especially to people in Oxford. In 1960, C.S. Lewis famously lamented both the disappearance of proper discourse about friendship and consequently a depreciated realization of friendship. Friendship, he wrote, quote, is something quite marginal, not a main course in life's banquet, a diversion, something that fills up the chunks of one's time, close quote. He continues, again in the 1960s, that friendship had, quote, very little to do with the philia which Aristotle classified among the virtues, or the amicitia on which Cicero wrote a book. Poets see things first. C.S. Lewis. Sociologists and historians may cite remote antecedents to each of the above-mentioned social movements. For present purposes, however, it will suffice to begin with events that lie within the living memory of at least some persons in this audience. As I look around, it might only be me. First, consider a movement that still vexes the political atmosphere of the United States of America, the Civil Rights Movement. Great Britain witnessed, though somewhat less rambunctiously, a similar development whose beginning I, an outsider, submit, one may identify with the government's signing in 1950 of the European Convention on Human Rights. In the United States, persons of my generation will recall that not a few Catholic clerics eventually joined civil rights protest marches. Of course, the foundational principles that undergird this movement, at least in its original conception, coincide with classical Catholic teaching. Unjust discrimination, as Summa Theologiae Secunda question 63 makes clear, never found endorsement in sound Catholic moral theology. At the same time, the Civil Rights Movement eventually contributed to the development of an inclusivist mentality that has adversely affected fraternal life and communion. Think of the appeal made to civil rights claims by other rights movements, especially, it must be said, LGBTQ plus activism. Contemporary political understandings of inclusivism, however, do not comport well with the pursuit of friendship or with the promotion of accompaniment. When one diminishes or destroys the differentiations that mark normal human society, one is left with either isolated individuals or with an unruly mob. Accompaniment becomes impossible to undertake inasmuch as each person claims equal and independent standing within the herd. Nietzsche saw this unhappy feature of modern culture, and thus spoke Zarathustra. The philosopher wrote, quote, "My brother, if you have a virtue and she is your virtue, then you have her in common with nobody." Very Nietzsche, close quote. The cry for an inclusivist society paradoxically leaves the members of the group in a state of self-imposed isolation. One can find, as you know, a list of 112 genders, including something called tra-gender. That includes all of them. Quote, a gender, yes, it's true, it's you can. The footnote is here. A gender that stretches over the whole spectrum of genders. However, this pinnacle of inclusiveness cannot avoid the question, how many transgender persons is one likely to meet in a given day? The second cultural revolution that dates from the mid-20th century concerns the place of women in society. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, first published in 1949 in Paris, Le Deuxième Sexe, marks a symbolic beginning of the modern feminist movement. The Church, especially under the tutelage of Pope John Paul II, masterfully co-opted what is salvageable from the secular feminist propositions. Professor Marianne Glendon, who had been an ambassador of the United States to the Holy See, has published widely on the topic. She claims that the old feminism of the 1970s is not only dead, but also produced harmful effects for women. So Catholic authors, including women, have taken up the call of Pope John Paul II to develop a new feminism to describe properly the feminine genius. Still, residues of the old feminism and misappropriations of Christian feminism continue to appear within the Catholic community. Sadly, some Catholic women, even religious, seem not to have grasped how defunct the old feminism of the 1970s has become. As a result, they continue to fall victim to notions that harm women. For example, some Catholic women refrain from receiving the sacraments from a male priest. Secular feminism without modification introduces a rupture between man and woman. It hardly requires an extended commentary to show that accompaniment becomes an impossible task once a Christian believer has accepted the feminist claim to an undifferentiated equality between the sexes. Catholic truth and practice do not put the sexes at odds with each other, moreover. Pope John Paul II stressed that the equality that exists between men and women does not, within the Christian view of creation, exclude differentiation of roles. This differentiation applies to the spheres of both nature and grace. Surviving secular feminist notions, on the other hand, make the pursuit of friendship and accompaniment powerless exercises. Proper accompaniment can recognize both spiritual mothers as well as fathers. However, sound practice will also appreciate the differences inherent in these diverse accompaniments. Something similar may be said for the natural order. In the United States, at least, it takes a good deal of political courage to acknowledge that fatherless families are more likely to produce male gang members than those families that enjoy a complete paternal influence. Thirdly, we turn to consider the movement that goes by the name of the sexual revolution. Both on this side of the Atlantic and in the United States, the current sexual revolution dates symbolically from 1968. Americans of my age recall the events that erupted in New York's Catskill Mountains between 15 and 18 August 1969. 50th anniversary celebrations of Woodstock, I'm here to tell you, it should come as no surprise, proved difficult to mount. They were pretty much worn out by then. In any event, the sexual revolution did not inaugurate the proliferation of sexual sins. Carnality has been around for some time. However, the public recognition of disordered sexual conduct has created a cultural environment that resists up to now a complete analysis. In the United States, I suspect also here, the reluctance of some parents to object to transgender provisions in neighborhood grammar schools affords only one example. One can only speculate on the long-term effects of encouraging transgender elementary and high school students to think of themselves as something other than they are. On this side of the pond, Wikipedia, I discovered, hosts a site titled transgender rights in the United Kingdom. One thing, however, does not lie open to dispute. The sexual revolution evolved quickly. 28 June 1969, 50 years ago this summer, marks an important moment within this evolution. The Stonewall Revolt in Manhattan, when the habitués of a gay bar in Greenwich Village resisted police attempts to disperse them, extended the kinds of sexual permissiveness that claimed public recognition to include homosexual practices. One may probably trace this turn of events back to the underground reactions that arose after the now recanted condemnations of Oscar Wilde. What is more important, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, though he draws on his experiences of developments in Germany, shared some of his recollections from the late 1960s time period. In short, the Pope Emeritus makes a crucial observation, which to my mind remains non-gainsayable. Quote, "Among the freedoms," writes Pope Benedict, "that the revolution of 1968 sought to fight for was this all-out sexual freedom, one which no longer conceded any norms." Unquote. Norms, of course, supply intelligibility for moral conduct. Without norms dictated by prudence, sense attractions measure everything that arises from the passions. Accompaniment without prudential norms would turn quickly into a risky business. Whistleblowers and the Me Too movement provide a few initial indications of what can go awry when friendships lose their moral compass. The 1960s sexual revolution has affected Catholic life in many ways. What is most important to observe, the sexual revolution introduced into the Catholic world something more pervasively negative than large-scale sexual indiscretions. The civic absolution granted to all but the most outlandish sexual activity, for instance, pedophilia, real pedophilia, and necrophilia, aimed to eliminate the need for most of the instructions that ascetical authors highly regarded and promulgated in their manuals. One obvious area where the sexual revolution arose Catholic practice concerns the sacrament of penance and reconciliation. Those sins that absorbed the casuist authors of the early 20th century, namely violations of the 6th and 9th commandment, disappeared, if not almost overnight, then within a few short years after the publication of Humani Vitae. Today, all discussions about autosexual activity remain difficult to entertain, except, of course, on a pornographic website. The negative influence of the sexual revolution surely extends to the sacrament of marriage. One need only to check the divorce rates and, what is more significant, the sacramental indices for weddings in each parish. Eventually, libertine practices also affect the sacraments of initiation. 1,000 confusions keep parents away from educating their children in the faith. Decline in the number of those baptized and confirmed are known to parish priests and bishops. I'm sure it's true as well in the United Kingdom. Holy Orders suffers. Bad sexual experience, even in adolescence and young adulthood, do not persuade young men that the life of a celibate cleric would suit them well. And finally, because sinners are not wont to worship God, recall the lessons of the Old Testament, a general dissolution of purity and chastity distances people from the Eucharist. In some, the sacramental accompaniments that the Church offers to aid moral development each have become weakened, if not eclipsed, by the normlessness and anomie that cast a shadow over our contemporaries. And these declines hold true for the better part of the Western world. The three 20th century revolutions clearly work against the good of moral development. The antidote for all distorted views of moral development is charity, rightly understood. The three secular revolutions, on the other hand, do not foster charity. In what follows, I will suggest that one may understand accompaniment as an outward expression of charity. First, charity, as Aquinas teaches, requires community. It does not flourish among a group of self-insulated free spirits. Second, charity establishes a differentiated whole. Cardinal Cajetan points to the human family as the natural analog for the communion of divine charity, where there is differentiation, parents, children, so forth. Charity then does not countenance a dissolution of the differences between male and female. And third, charity forms the other virtues. It does not abide normless sexual encounters. In a word, charity ensures that friendships remain unconfused. The phrase unconfused friendship actually appears in Aquinas' Expositio of Pseudo-Denis's De Divinis Nominibus. But I have a feeling, looking at it, that it was a mistranslation of the Greek, St. Thomas, the translation he had, because the word doesn't seem to appear in Pseudo-Denis's own text. However, it's a nice expression anyways, unconfused friendship. Yeah. That's the third and final part. So philosophy students suffer early on that Aristotle introduces a discussion of friendship into his Nicomachean Ethics. Specifically, Aristotle devotes Book 8 and 9 to the subject, where he says that friendship, quote, is a virtue, applies virtue, and is besides most necessary with a view to living. Earlier in the same text, in Book 4, Aristotle broaches the notion of friendship within a discussion of social interactions among men. Thus, Aquinas rightly observes that in the Ethics, Aristotle discusses two forms of amicitia. For his part, Aquinas likewise picks up on the notion of friendship in two principal places in the Secunda Secundae of his Summa Theologiae. The first treatment appears as one of the potential parts of the cardinal moral virtue of justice. Aquinas explains these potential parts in Secunda Secundae, question 80, if you want to refresh your memory. Then in question 114 of the Secunda Secundae, Aquinas discusses amicitia, which the best translations render as friendliness. One quality of goodness, explains Aquinas, is right order. In the ordinary dealings with others, people ought to be agreeable, both in word and in act, so that each one observes the decency toward his fellow men. Virtue is required for a person to sustain this good disposition. The potential part of justice, Aquinas calls friendliness or affability, amicitia or affabilitas. Aristotle, on the other hand, refrained from naming such a virtue, which he nevertheless affirms stands between obsequiousness and contentiousness, though he did admit that, quote, it most resembles friendship. For our purposes, it seems that accompaniment would require on the part of both the one accompanying and the one being accompanied that each person exhibits this virtue of affability. Affability may not exclude someone's offering a firm but loving correction. At the same time, this kind of virtuous comportment would exclude eruptions of harsh and abrasive words or deeds among one's fellows. Friendliness belongs to those of good manners and the well-bred. Among such as these, accompaniment is most likely to succeed. The friendship that properly belongs to accompaniment is that which Aristotle discusses in Book 8 and 9 of his Ethics. Perfect friendship, he writes, quote, is the friendship of men who are good and alike in virtue, for these wish well alike to each other qua good, and they are good in themselves. That's a famous definition, and that, as we'll see, is what benevolent love is about. The scholastics call this kind of loving the love of friendship or benevolent loving. Why does Aquinas find reason to introduce Aristotle's considerations on friendship into his theological discussion of the virtue of charity? The answer, in short, he reads St. John's Gospel. And there he hears Christ assuring his disciples that he no longer calls them servants, but friends. Question 23 of the Secunda Secundae unfolds as a remarkable treatise on the main virtue of the Christian life, one in which sound pagan philosophy serves to illuminate the greatest Christian virtue. Thus St. Paul celebrated affirmation, and now there remain faith, hope, and charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity, and that's from the Douay translation. After all, we're in England. The first article of question 23 asks whether charity is a friendship, utrum caritas sit amicitia. It pleases me to provide an extended quotation from one of the Dominicans' great Thomist, Father Thomas Gilby, whom, as a young student in Washington, I had the pleasure of meeting. In the introduction to volume 34 of his edition of the Summa, Father Gilby wrote about the love of charity. I'm going to go slow here. This is pure Gilby, and with an economy of words that opens up a remarkable view of things. Charity is more than loving of the good for you, and more than loving the good for another. It is loving shared by you and another, of such sort that the terms egoism and altruism are irrelevant. It is the wholehearted love of God, but is no more self-denying at the deepest level than the object in the union of knowledge and love spells diminishment for the subject. Close quote. The accompaniment that ensures proper moral development in cleric, consecrated person, and layperson springs from the communicatio benevolentiae, that is, the communication or exchange of benevolent love that is charity. As such, proper accompaniment diminishes neither the one who accompanies nor the one who is accompanied. Like creation, accompaniment should proceed as labor without toil. The Latin word communicatio, as you know, is not the equivalent of the modern English word communication. Once the English liturgy translated the word as fellowship. Now we say at the opening greeting of Mass, the communion of the Holy Spirit, the communicatio sancti spiritus. 2 Corinthians 13:14 inspired this greeting found in the Roman Missal. Gratia Domini nostri Jesu Christi et caritas Dei et communicatio sancti spiritus. This sort of supernatural communicatio differs essentially from the commonwealth of being that all creatures share with the Creator. The communion of the Holy Spirit means that God's own benevolence becomes ours by participation. Thus Christ's words, I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. Charity, of course, follows faith. Charity implies reciprocity. Aquinas cryptically makes the point in the first article of question 23. Quote, goodwill alone is not enough for friendship, for this requires a mutual sharing. It is only with a friend that a friend is friendly. The Latin phrase, really difficult to translate. Quia amicus est, amico amicus. You're only a friend with your friend. What does this mean? Aquinas spells out some of the implications that characterize the bond of charity-driven friendship. We find them not in the Summa Theologiae, but in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 4, chapters 21 and 22. These chapters merit a thoughtful reading for anybody that wants to practice accompaniment. There, Aquinas identifies 6 features of friendship that illuminate the kind of accompaniment that aids moral development. In the Contra Gentiles, Aquinas divides these 6 features into the 3 things that God accomplishes in us, chapter 21, and the 3 ways we are moved toward God, chapter 22. For the purposes of the present discussion, we can take each feature as a quality that should undergird friendship and the accompaniment it entails. Now, I'll briefly go through these 6. Each one of them could merit an individual talk, if not a longer period of reflection. But I'll signal them to you, and you can do your own thinking about them. It's Summa Contra Gentiles 4, 21, and 22. So first, Aquinas signals as characteristic of friendship the exchange of personal knowledge or openness. Of course, he says, quote, this is a proper mark of friendship, that one reveal his secrets to his friend. Every confessor knows that the sacrament of reconciliation requires openness. In fact, hiding serious sin invalidates the confession. The reason for this provision arises from the need for an integral confession in order to accomplish full reconciliation. Put otherwise, to borrow an image from the rule of St. Augustine, chapter 7, the wound that the doctor cannot see cannot be healed. Even outside of the confession, and outside of those natural secrets that arise in spiritual direction, openness supplies the first step for accompaniment in virtue development. Implementation of this first expression of friendship, of course, requires a refined discretion. Aquinas obviously does not counsel an indiscriminate sharing of one's sins or temptations with whatsoever person. The openness that Aquinas has in mind concerns spiritual matters and perhaps trials. Effective accompaniment that leads to growth in virtue requires openness and the sharing of secrets. Attempts to bypass this sharing undermines the communication of friendship. In other words, to take one example, you cannot help a person grow in the virtue of purity and chastity if he or she does not disclose the dangerous liaisons that threaten these virtues. The second feature of charity's friendship requires a sharing of goods. Now, says Aquinas, quote, "It is not only proper to love, to charity, that one reveal his secrets to a friend by reason of their unity and affection, but the same unity requires that what he have in common with the friend." Aquinas explains that since the friend is another self, it follows that friends succor each other as if they were taking care of themselves. Very high view of friendship. This feature of friendship finds easy realization among those who share a common life, especially one consecrated under a vow of poverty. In fact, moral development transpires more easily within a common or community life. Can a very rich man help a very poor man grow in virtue? Perhaps. However, a common life holds out much better prospects for one person's helping another. When an actual sharing of goods is not possible, those who would accompany another in virtue development can at least profess a shared life in preparatione animae. Like the poor widow who puts 2 small coins into the treasury and who receives praise because one assumes that were she to become rich, she would act munificently. The third feature of friendship figures in the Lord's Prayer, pardon of every offense. Of course, writes Aquinas, quote, "By the fact that one is established as the friend of another, every offense is removed because friendship and offense are contraries. It should be clear that one rightfully would hesitate before receiving personalized moral guidance from someone who remains an enemy. The category of enemy may refer to a broad range of persons, including those whose offenses, though small, reveal a deliberate failure in love. Christ himself places forgiveness at the heart of the Communicatio Benevolentiae when he teaches his disciples how to pray. See Matthew 6:12. The fourth feature of friendship conduces to accompaniment in virtue, Aquinas calls contemplation. He emphasizes this feature of friendship when he writes, again in the Summa Contra Gentiles, quote, "Indeed, this appears to be especially proper to friendship, really to converse with the friend," unquote. It would be an odd friendship that entailed no communication or dealings between the friends. C.S. Lewis emphasizes the origin of friendships, which he contrasts with clubbable companionship, in communication. Quote, "The typical expression," Lewis writes, quote, "of opening friendship would be something like, 'What, you too? I thought I was the only one,' end quote. The old friend is one with whom you have not spoken for 10 years, with whom you have nothing left to share." They multiply as you get older. There may be some exceptions to this rule. However, generally, friendship requires active contemplation, a mutual exchange of knowledge and love between the two friends. This personal exchange between friends, Aquinas suggests, resembles the contemplation of God that the Holy Spirit enables when he makes us lovers of God. There exists no intrinsic reason why a spiritual guide should not become friends with someone he or she may have helped to grow in virtue. The fifth feature of friendship that should also characterize a virtuous accompaniment of another with a view toward moral development, Aquinas calls interior joy. Quote, "It is also a property of friendship," writes Aquinas, "that one take delight in a friend's presence, rejoice in his words and deeds, and find in him security against all anxieties. And so it is especially in our sorrows that we hasten to our friends for consolation." It advances nothing to put the saints at odds with one another. At the same time, a reasonable person may surmise that St. Thomas and St. Alphonsus offer somewhat different views of the role that friends play when one or another experiences desolation. Recall Father Pincair's remark that the modern spiritual authors neglected friendship. In any case, accompaniment should proceed from a joyful relationship, not a dour one. Virtuous people may, on Aquinas' view, rightly expect to find godly consolation from their friends and mentors. Now, St. Alphonsus may not have fully grasped what Aquinas teaches about formal and material objects, that is, his explanation, Aquinas' explanation, of how other persons can be taken up into the love of God. In other words, the formal object makes them participate in the material object, if you will, of charity, which is God and the things of God. The sixth and final feature of friendship that Aquinas notes in the Contra Gentiles involves harmony of wills. It is proper to friendship to consent to a friend in what he wills. This feature follows from the five already mentioned. Moral accompaniment supposes that the one accompanying possess some quality of soul that the one accompanied does not. What else should result from this accompaniment other than a harmony of wills? You know, if you have a friend who's given to telling lies, a truthful person wants him to have a harmony of wills, which is to say, to stop lying and to become a truthful man. Some persons in the church look askance on influence. They seem to fear that active loving might undermine legitimate authority. Of course, bad examples of seduction exist. In the United States, one investigation after another has revealed the malfeasance of coaches, doctors, and educators. Abusus non tollit usus, as the casuist authors like to remind us. We can't be frightened by the bad examples. Aquinas, on the other hand, makes it difficult for us to express skepticism about a harmony of wills that develops among friends as long as the bond of charity and the virtues it informs remain intact. So I suggest that the accompaniment that the Church once again has put forward as an essential feature for the formation of clerics requires no further analysis than what Aquinas provides in his discussion of friendship and charity. What is more important, everybody can discover the importance of accompaniment in moral development by examining how authentic friendship, you should pardon the expression, works. It is difficult to live an examined life without friends. On the other hand, when the Catholic people love each other in charity, they form one another in Christian virtue. The message, as anyone who has read the New Testament realizes, is not groundbreaking. The spiritual authors of the modern period admittedly tried to communicate this truth when they stressed the unum necessarium, love based on fellowship with God in charity. Some corollaries come quickly to mind. First, while professional psychological counseling may serve some useful purposes for certain persons, the psychological sciences cannot dictate the terms of accompaniment. Still less should psychological theories replace the dynamics of charity. Marxism fears accompaniment. In the United States, at least, some church leaders have begun to warn against power differentials. In order to escape the risk of someone abusing power, they even counsel caution in loving. Okay, third, while the abuse of minors crisis has probably forestalled a recrudescence of Woodstock-inspired yoga practices, whirlpools, and half-clothed sensitivity sessions, there remains the temptation to equate the love of charity with sentimentalism and other comfortable modes of human congress. Other challenges to our putting charity back into the center of moral development also exists. Those who are confused about how to accompany should read Aquinas on charity. To bring this conference to a conclusion, allow me to encourage a return to the Thomist commentatorial tradition. This is a plug, full disclosure. One, of course, finds sound teaching among other of the church's teachers and doctors. Did you hear me say that, Father Andrew? Yeah. As Dominicans, however, Aquinas remains chez nous. Yeah, he's ours. The continuous commentatorial tradition that has carried on his instruction, among whose eminent figures many have belonged to the province of England, offers precious elaboration on the text of Aquinas, and more would have belonged to it had it not been for the Reformation, that's obvious. One period that may bring further insight into a discussion of charity and accompaniment finds its geographical center in 17th century Toulouse. This is for the young Dominicans if they're looking for a topic. In particular, I propose the work of the Toulouse Dominican Vincent de Contenson, who died in 1674. His sole, he's a good person to write dissertation on, he has one work. His sole composition, Theologia Mentis et Cordis, left incomplete at his early death, qualifies as a work of mystical or ascetical theology. What makes Contenson's Theologia, last published in Paris, mind you, in 1886, the Leonine Revival, unique? What makes it unique lies in the solid infrastructure of dogma that undergirds its composition. In other words, he wanted people to be interpersonal but founded on dogma, which keeps, in other words, makes the distinction between dogma and moral otios, which in fact, of course, it is. However, last point. He also was one of the first Thomist authors to take strong exception to probabilism. What better sign of authentic accompaniment for sound moral development may one demand? Thank you.